welcome to the Paddock Pass podcast, Argentine Grand Prix review show. The big race finished just over 2 hours ago, and we've been able to get all the latest news from inside the MotoGP paddock just for you. But obviously, we're here to talk about the Argentine Grand Prix, and on patreon.com/Paddock Pass podcast, we have our regular end of round vote for who was the rider of the race, and it was pretty resounding. It was Johann Zarco that won this with 45% of the vote. And Adam, I think everyone's going to be in pretty much agreement about that. A really good weekend from Zarco.
Absolutely, Steve. Actually, Zarco's my pick for higher because we have our categories towards the end of this podcast. But yeah, I mean, if anything, Zarco is proving that he's not just like a testing mule. He's bringing the performance as well. And also he was probably the most emblematic token that HRC are really making forward steps. It's very strange to imagine that Honda are like the slowest bike, on the main straight and in the speed traps now, but that's a weakness that they can probably tweak a little bit. And I know we have the engine freeze, but Zarco was brilliant. And this wasn't just like a freak result or some sort of flash in the pan. He really sort of made it happen right the way through the Grand Prix from Friday.
Yeah, and Franco Morbidelli ended up second in that, and Marquez was third. And Neil, Ian gave us a comment on Patreon as well, saying there's only one alien left in MotoGP, and Marc shows that every time. I think there's a lot of people thinking that as well right now.
I think it's a fair comment. I would like to think there's more than one alien in MotoGP at the moment, but certainly what we've seen so far in 2025, it's been the Marquez show really, yeah, it's going to take some stopping.
Obviously enough, we also have our grades for each round, and Neil, I'll ask you for your grade first.
Well, it's always quite difficult judging the Grand Prix when you're not there, Steve. None of us were on the ground in Argentina this weekend. I mean, watching from afar, the racing was okay. The sprint was pretty bad. Sunday was relatively interesting. Moto3 race was good. Good attendance. 6, I'm going to give it out of 10.
A good attendance. There was well over 200,000 people there, and I could hear David
Emmett
already shouting in the distance. But Adam, what about you? What was your rating?
It was, 79,000? That's not my rating. That was 79,000.
79,000 out of 10. Jesus.
For on Sunday. My rating, I'm just going to give it one more mark than Neil did, purely because of the atmosphere, which is kind of unusual throughout the season to hear, the fans. I mean, we had some of our colleagues and friends like Comac GP sent a message in our WhatsApp chat group saying that, the grandstands and the spectator enclosures, which are tricky to see on the TV footage, were full. And to hear the chanting, see the excitement, it's a really kind of clear and obvious answer that Argentina really deserves a place on the MotoGP calendar. It's, in Termas itself, I think it's a wonderful racetrack. And, it does bring problems, of course, because of the infrequent use, with the grip and the dirtiness. That was something they addressed, for this edition compared to 2023. But I thought, we had some pretty entertaining racing. And I think it also says a lot that people are picking other riders over Marc Marquez for their rider of the GP. The Marquez train is firmly rolling, but then, people are already starting to look through the MotoGP field for other achievements and feats. And that's also going to be one of the things we're going to have to do this season.
Yeah, I think for me, I'd probably be pretty close to the 7 for you, just because I remember being in Argentina, and that race was always a fun race to go to just because of the atmosphere. And you could see that coming through on the screen as well. I'm not a big fan of showing pictures of the crowds during the race whenever there's an overtake happening or there's a battle going on, but you could see what it meant to the fans. And I think that's always quite cool whenever it's the only race that we go to for South America. So I'll go with a 7. Mostly beefed up, Neil, just because the Moto3 race. Great last few laps to that one. But in terms of the moments, Adam, what was your moment of the Argentine Grand Prix?
For me, it was the Marquez front end slide. I think it was into turn 5. Thanks, Neil, for double checking that with earlier on. But I think it revealed that, once Alex Marquez had moved to the front of the race, we were kind of thinking, is this just going to be another sort of play and ploy by his brother? But I think it showed that moment there from March that he actually had to push. And post-race in the press conference, he said he had been struggling a little bit, trying to feel comfortable. It was his first race at Termas, since 2019. That's a long time. Obviously, he's still feeling his way with the GP 24 point something. So it wasn't as easy as it looked, and it certainly wasn't as easy as Thailand, which also bodes quite well for how well Alex Marquez is riding, the potential threat he could bring, and there might be one or two others that could get a little bit closer than what we saw in Buriram.
Yeah, I think for me, my moment would be Zarco's quali lap, because putting that Honda on the front row, super impressive. But it also showed that Friday wasn't a fluke, and then he was able to build on it all the way through the weekend. So I thought that was, for me, one of the big stories of the week, and
Good
my
shout.
moment of the week. But Neil, what about you? What's yours?
I mean, I love Zarco and I love what he did all weekend. Feels a bit cruel then choosing potentially Di Giannantonio's move on him on the last lap through turn 11 as the moment, because that was just a beautiful move. And Digi had a really inspired ride in the last couple of laps to nick fifth off Zarco. But because I love Zarco so much, I'm going to go for Angel Piqueras' last lap, or penultimate corner overtake to win the Moto3 race. It looked like he sort of messed it up, exiting turn 9 and 10, got on the green, and you thought, oh, well, he's really buggered it up now. Let Rueda through, but then really bruised it under him into that turn 13 right. And it was a sort of no nonsense, no holds barred overtake. Albon, who is probably going to be the rider who's probably going to be his main title contender this year, out of the way for the victory, and ensuring that another Spaniard got through into second to demote Rueda to third. So, I think a lot of expectation had been on Piqueras' shoulders. That team had to pay 200 grand to pry him away from Leopard racing last year. And there was talk in Thailand that maybe a little bit of pressure was was starting to affect Angel. We didn't see the best of him at all in Thailand. But this was the rider that MSI got the checkbook out for. It's a slightly ominous sign for the Moto3 field.
Yeah,
the theatrics of it. Sorry, Steve. The theatrics of it, Neil. You can't dispute. I agree with it, but isn't it a bit of a contentious move? I mean, he went off the track and he was in a prime position then to push Rueda wide and seal the win.
Robin's racing.
Okay.
I mean, it wasn't anything dirty. It was tough, but it wasn't dirty, you would say. By Moto3 standards.
I think it was one of those ones, though, just whenever we saw him run onto the green, that you're then thinking, oh, no, that's the job done. And it was good to be able to see that there was a bit of common sense applied as well. So I liked this moment. I thought it was a great moment. I like Piqueras because I remember seeing him coming through the junior GP paddock. Him, Rueda, they were in that group behind the likes of Holgado, Alonso, and they were always very highly regarded. So it'll be interesting to see how he does this year with that pressure to be that championship contender. And I think that obviously that brings us nicely to our first talking points of the weekend as well. And the big title contender, Marc Marquez. It turns out that if you put the greatest rider we've ever seen on the best bike on the grid, he's pretty good, Neil. And we were able to see Marc take pole, a 1-2 for the Marquezes in both races, and they continue that perfect start to the season.
Yeah, well, if you look at the record book, Steve, he's only the joint third best rider in history, going off Grand Prix victories. I mean, Giacomo Agostini and Valentino Rossi are still ahead of him. So two riders to overhaul in that regard.
Okay, then the best rider we've ever seen.
Right. Okay. Well, I'm sure a few listeners
semantics.
Yeah, let's not get into semantics at this early stage. It was another textbook weekend really for Marc, wasn't it? I think the most interesting thing to say about him really is that, just to follow on from Adam's moment, it did look that he actually had to work a little bit on the Sunday, which I think is a good thing to see, because on Saturday he just looked so in control and so comfortable ahead of his brother that it just almost seemed that he was just cruising around. And Alex got a little bit close to him on a couple of occasions during the sprint, but Marc never really looked as though he was getting out of third or fourth gear. Whereas he made that mistake into turn 1 early into the race. He did look a wee bit uncomfortable. Alex was able to get, 0.4 of a second here and hold that for a couple of laps. And then there was just a couple of times where he had pretty close moments, that front end moment that Adam talked about. Then also, I think he almost lost the rear coming around turn 11. And there were a few signs of he looked more like Marquez on the bike rather than this kind of rider who's just on a Ducati and going super fast and super smooth, like we saw in Thailand, like we saw on Saturday. it actually looked like Marc riding the Honda on certain occasions. But again, it was pretty impressive just how he left everyone for dead, left Alex for dead in those last couple of laps. There was a moment in the race where you thought, is Alex going to manage to hold on to this? Because he had an exceptional ride. I mean, that was probably his best ever ride, going across all Grand Prix classes, you would have to say. I think there was one point in the race where Marc actually said, I might have to settle for second here. But with 5-6 laps to go, he's just such an expert at kind of keeping his powder dry and managing the rear tire. And the rear tire is really so critical to manage it at Termas with all those long left-handers, double apex lefts that you have on the track. And once he got in front, I mean, it was just like a sort of exhibition really in the last couple of laps, wasn't it? It was like Thailand. It was 9/10 of a second in a lap and a half that he managed to put into Alex. I mean, we're 2 races in and you're starting to think like, what kind of records can Marc break this year? You know, in terms of, most wins in the season, biggest points achieved in the season. I'm genuinely thinking that.
It's also weird, the contrasts. Like, I'm happy that Marquez said that he struggled, but then, I'm also concerned but the fact that he struggled and was still so good in a class apart from everybody else. I'm pleased by the fact that he's not leading every single lap and he's disappearing. But then he's also racing his brother, and he knows, as kind of Alex was referencing in the post-race podcast, press conference, sorry, they know each other very well, and they know each other's weaknesses and strengths, and therefore, it's probably the ideal rival really for Marc. Ideal also, that's a contrast because, he can't really sort of rattle his brother too much. There's a certain extent where he's gonna, we all kind of assume that Marquez would sort of sell his mum for a victory, but then he's getting to the point where he really would have to fuck over a family member to get dirty and sort of crank things up a knot in terms of the controversy. But
don't count it out.
Yeah, absolutely. I don't know, Steve. I think it's looking worrying for the championship that he's cleaned up every single session for 2 GPs in a row, and Cota's next. I mean, you might as well just slap Sachsenring as round 4 really, and it's just going to be a complete red wash. I just hope that Alex could possibly do something. Maybe Martin can come back and throw in a couple of freak results in the second half of the season, and Bagnaia, maybe we can talk about him in a moment, but he's stuck in some sort of vortex where he can't establish the same rate of performance that we had in 2024, but then also he has this new sort of barometer of excellence to reach, and will he be able to do it?
I think there was 2 slightly concerning things for everyone here. I mean, Marc, as we mentioned, hadn't been to Argentina since 2019. That's a pretty long time to be away from a track. He shows up on a new bike, has to relearn it, and he's top in every single session bar 1. And then that, but
he won 3 times then, so it's not like it was a bogey circuit for him.
Sure, but still, topped every session bar 1, and in that one he didn't. He was second. And then also he was just saying how he pretty much didn't have to change the bike that much. He had to work on his electronics on Friday, but otherwise it seems that he's got such a solid, settled base setting, which is working for him. And, just compare that to the other side of the box.
Yeah, I think that's the big thing, is that we've been able to see just how Marc can just destroy people in the past. And it's very difficult to not look at Pecco and think the same won't happen to him, even though Pecco's obviously had all that success. We talked about it on the Paddock Note show as well, about the fact that for Bagnaia, he's always been the guy that all of the bigwigs at Ducati have gone to look for feedback. And now he's looking at them all go to someone else. And that's always tough for a rider to deal with. And that's where mentally Pecco needs to be absolutely rock solid. And the problem with that is he's not as fast as Marc. So then even whenever he's got that ability to keep himself calm, it may not be enough. And I think that kind of leads us into a couple of questions that we had from some of our patrons as well. Because Neil Graham was asking, what happens when Pecco actually gets the better of Marc for a race? He's in front of Marc and he seems like he's got that speed all the way through the race. Will Marc go into beast mode and risk everything just to beat Pecco, or will he think of the championship?
I think Marc in this form is probably going to be looking at Pecco's normal brilliant tracks and be thinking, this is where I really need to really ride on the ragged edge. So yeah, I'd say beast mode. And the problem for Bagnaia is that we're 2 races into the season and it's early days, but he's already 31 points in arrears. I mean, that is a fairly substantial gap to be trying to make up on Marc in this form. And as you say, with Austin ahead, I mean, that could realistically, that's probably going to be about 50 points by the time we leave America. So that's a big old gap to be taken into round 3, and then suddenly the pressure's really on. Like when you get to Qatar, it's like, okay, I have to deliver here. Everything is hanging on this round because, if I can't do it here, then where am I going to be able to do it? And that's a ridiculous amount of pressure to be having at round 4 of the year.
2 things. Firstly, we haven't seen Pecco lead a lap yet so far in 2025. And I think it'll be curious to see how he reacts when he actually gets ahead of Marquez. I think, like Neil says, Marc can engage beast mode and then sort of attack in a different way or ride in a different way, like we've seen him. We've seen like shades of that today against his brother. But the other thing as well for Bagnaia is I still don't think he's there with a setup, and I think he's going to have a larger, bigger picture view to the whole season, because I think he knows that a mistake is going to come from Marquez at some point, whether Marc hasn't got a feeling with a particular track or he isn't able to sort of now his setup at a certain venue, and Bagnaia can take, maybe advantage of that. He only needs one slip, one broken bone. I mean, look at the fate of Jorge Martin. I mean, that could easily happen to Marquez again, and then suddenly Bagnaia gets a sniff of it. I think he just has to be a little bit more wily and not be eyeing, okay, I won 11 Grand Prix this year, I need to win 12 this year. I mean, I think he knows that's not going to happen, but he just has to sort of stay in the game as much as he can.
Yeah, I think for me, one of the interesting things, just to go back to Graham's question, is we saw how much Marc was willing to risk against Quartararo in Thailand in 2019 to win the championship. And he wasn't thinking about winning races. He was only thinking about winning races and beating his rival. So I think that sort of sets the tone for how Marc's always approached things. If he's been a little bit more calculating, maybe that shows that he's learned a lot of lessons over the course of the last few years. We also had a question in from Hardy, and this brings us in nicely into our next topic as well, Adam, because it brings Pecco back into the equation as well. But who wins a race first, Alex Marquez or Pecco Bagnaia?
On the evidence so far, you would have to say Alex. But then, I mean, Kota hasn't been sort of the best track for Pecco in the past. But that's a tough one to say. I'd still say Bagnaia because he's, there are traces still of that winning form from last year. I mean, that doesn't go away that quickly, I think, even though sort of races notoriously short-termist. I think, against Marc in Austin, it's going to be, difficult. It'd be like sort of standing in front of an avalanche. But, I would put more money on the Italian to do something first. And then I want to see the kind of reaction or the impetus that it gives him.
I think it's quite interesting just some of the things that the Marquez brothers have been saying through the weekend. I think Marc said after the sprint on Saturday that obviously Alex is his closest rival at the moment, but they are making concerted efforts to work together throughout the weekend to try and give each other advice, to try and point each other in the right direction in terms of, okay, I'm strong here, maybe you can improve at this point. I mean, Alex all weekend had very clear advantage in turn, I think 3 and turn 6, Marc said, and those like long corners which lead onto the straight where you're accelerating with high lean angle. Marc was saying that his bike is a bit more set up to be strong in heavy braking zones, whereas Alex is to have a bit more flow, carry a bit more corner speed. And obviously there's brotherly love there, and Marc has always tried to help Alex out when he can. But you also have to think that there's an added dynamic in that if Alex is strong, it's another person between him and Bagnaia, and Bagnaia is ultimately going to be his biggest rival this year. And it's just another very kind of ingenious way of trying to get one over your rival, because you're not just putting the bike between yourself and him, you're putting a guy on a year-old bike ahead of your rival that's going to start playing with his head. And then I don't know if you saw it, but there was a great moment after the flag show when he was being interviewed by Matt Burt in the broadcaster set. And he said, Alex is my biggest rival this year. And okay, he has a point. Alex has been second in the 4 races that we've had, but that's also a little knife in the side of Bagnaia, saying that, oh, mate, you're getting beaten by a guy on a year-old bike here. So yeah, I mean, it's those little subtle things which Marc is just such an expert at, getting the digs in and yeah, trying to wind the person up ever so slightly. So yeah, I think it's it's a pretty genius ploy.
But it's important to remember that Ducati are not going to ignore Bagnaia. And I think you have to look at the first stage of the season, because we will go to Austin, then we'll go to Qatar. And then when we get to Jerez, then I think you'll see a little bit more development or some progression made. And also with the Jerez test is going to be pivotal, not just for Bagnaia and Ducati potentially, but also for the likes of Aprilia and for KTM, and the Japanese. So I think if Ducati finds something to help Bagnaia, whether it's a new part or a modification, then he's going to carry that on his GP 24 point whatever, and Alex Marquez might not necessarily get that. So that could be another area of differential as we go into the center part of the season. Could help Pecco either on the starts or some other aspect of general setup that allows him to pull ahead of the Spaniard a bit more.
Yeah, I think it's interesting as well, though, the fact that everyone's kind of clinging on the fact that for Pecco, and we'll move on just to talk a little bit more about Pecco rather than the Marquez's, but for Pecco, everything hinges on, he's good in Jerez, he's good in Mugello, he's good at Assen and these kind of places. Other than, like, Mugello, Marquez has only won there once. Marc has lots of wins, lots of podiums at all these tracks as well. And I think that that's where it really does become interesting to see what happens to Pecco. And that does bring us into the big Pecco talking point of how can he stay strong mentally with this barrage going on? Because Neil, you mentioned there about how smart Marc was to say that Alex is his biggest rival. What makes that even smarter is Alex hasn't won a Grand Prix. So Marc is sitting there saying to Pecco, this dude that hasn't even won a Grand Prix is better than you right now. And it just keeps shoveling a little bit more coal into the fire.
I think on Saturday, Bagnaia he certainly wore the expression of someone that wasn't pulling his hair out. He was quite content to finish third in the sprint, I think. It's never been a great track for him in Termas. I think the previous best result of 5th indicates that. So I don't think he was coming into this weekend thinking he was going to win. But then Sunday again, after a pretty good start and actually attacking Alex Marquez at the start, it hinted at something, that usual Bagnaia progression through the weekend. Maybe he was saving his best for the Sunday. But then to watch kind of Franco Morbidelli just breeze by him, and I know Morbidelli was on the soft rear tire, but there was a point maybe with 3 or 4 laps to go where you thought maybe Pecco's sprint coming back into this. I think he got within half a second of Morbidelli, and then it was just, that was it. Morbidelli held them off kind of at arm's length. And for 3 Ducatis to finish in front of him is, it's not great. It's definitely not great. And I think he said to one of our colleagues, Elliot York, after the race, in Thailand, it was, I can't brake as I did with last year's bike. But I think he was saying to Elliot today that all aspects of the setup are missing. And yeah, they still just have work to do. And he does have this kind of habit of starting the season slowly. We've seen this in each of the past 4 seasons. And this year he just doesn't really have that advantage of a rival that is going to be inconsistent or maybe going to throw points away. Like, he needs to get on it ASAP.
Adam, just for you, obviously, for part of your research for your book, you actually spent a lot of time with Pecco as well. What's his mindset usually like? How strong is he mentally to be able to deal with all this?
It's just like I said, Steve. He has, and Neil mentioned as well, he hasn't got the setup yet, with this year's race bike. And I wouldn't be surprised if he is just taking bigger picture. He's not, thinking, shit, I'm losing to Marc every race. I think he's being methodical and approaching this season like he approaches a Grand Prix. He builds into it. Yeah, you see flashes of emotion and frustration sometimes, but let's not forget we're talking about the best rider of the last sort of 2 to 3, 4 seasons in MotoGP, and I don't think he'll get rattled that easily. If anybody knew how good Marquez could be in that factory team, it's him. So this is not like a huge shock. But, it will come good for Bagnaia, and he will be competitive against Marquez. We're going to see some decent battles, I think, this season. But, like Neil said, I mean, it's over 30 points after 2 races. what does that mean for the championship? It's going to take a major slip up by, his new teammate to maybe swing the pendulum. But then, we're also talking about a racer who came back from 91 points down. So, anything could really happen.
At the Paddock Pass podcast, we're teamed up with Renthal Street for aftermarket parts for your bike. So check out the Fit My Bike tool at renthal.com to see the handlebars, chains, sprockets, and more that fit your bike. This year, we're also teamed up with Pole Position Travel. And Pole Position Travel have two really cool race packages available on polepositiontravel.com. So check it out for the French Grand Prix and the British Grand Prix. For the French Grand Prix, you can stay in a hotel that's in the city centre of Le Mans. So you're right in the middle of the medieval old town, and you can then join the MotoGP paddock for one of the best atmospheres of the season. At the British Grand Prix, you can have a really cool package because Silverstone is one of the most historic circuits that we visit in the MotoGP World Championship. And for this one, you've got a range of options available to you. You can stay within walking distance of the circuit, or you can stay in a 15th century coach inn, which allows you to take in all the history that's associated with the circuit. And from Pole Position Travel, there's also a range of options available for you. So you can have general admission tickets, grandstand tickets, or what you really should do is you should treat yourself to the team experiences and get inside the MotoGP paddock. So you can do this with the Grassini team in the Premier Class, the Aspar team in Moto2, or MLAV Racing for their home race in the Moto3 World Championship. With Pole Position Travel, there's circuit transfers included. There's a welcome drink on the Thursday night. And Adam, there's also a Friday dinner with guest speakers. And you've got a little bit that you can add about that.
Well, Steve, first of all, I think describing Silverstone as one of the most historic tracks on the calendar, although factually true, is probably having all the Dutchmen who, all the three Dutchmen that listen to our podcast
not
screaming.
Here today.
Yeah, David Emmett missing in action, pulled a back muscle through screaming and celebrating at the finale of the Moto3 race. That may or may not be fake information. We'll let the listeners decide. But yeah, back to your point, Steve. A quick reminder to everybody that we're doing the very first ever Paddock Pass podcast live show on Friday of the Jerez Grand Prix, the Spanish Grand Prix, in the Sherry Park Hotel. There's 3 ways to come on, watch and listen to us. That's to come along and have a drink. There's one of those tickets. Also to have the full meal experience, which starts from 7:30. We're going to be trying not to bore people from 8:30 in the evening for an hour, but we will be recording. We will be doing a kind of interactive Paddock Pass podcast. People can also turn up on the door, pay €25, get a drinks token, and also sort of join in the fun. So there's a way to get the food and the drink through the Pole Position Travel website. If you use the code PPOD25X, that's PPOD25X, and you get a discount. But then also if you're sort of floating around Jerez and you fancy just, coming for a bit of light entertainment, then rock up at the Sherry Park Hotel, pay the money on the door, make sure you're there before 8:30, and then you'll be able to listen to us.
Yeah, and you'll be able to see big Neil Morrison in the flesh as well. And Neil, obviously everyone's very excited about that. How excited are you for it?
Very excited, Steve. I mean, always excited to get to Jerez, one of the best runs in the calendar for sure. And even more excited that we'll be hopefully getting to meet some of our listeners. Yeah,
and obviously Coda coming up next on the calendar, and we're definitely going to have the opportunity to meet up with quite a few of our patrons as well over the course of the Grand Prix of the Americas. But yeah, let's move it on to the swing and pendulum as well for Honda, because I was listening and watching on TNT Sports, and it was funny that Neil Hodgson said, look at how good that Honda's turning. I can't remember the last time the Honda did anything well. And then this weekend we were able to see that for Johann Zarco, obviously he got the accolade of being the Paddock Pass podcast rider of the day, which is the main goal
just as
for
important
all riders.
As the result. That's just as important as the 6th place.
Obviously. Yeah. So for Johann, though, that front row of the grid, good in the sprint, good in the Grand Prix. It was really impressive to see that, Neil.
It was, yeah. And, as you said there, Steve, it wasn't just one strong day. I think he was lowest of 7th in every session, if you looked at every session across the weekend. So really, really solid. I think maybe a little disappointed with Sunday, considering on Saturday he thought he could fight for the podium today. And certainly in the first couple of laps, he was given a really good go. The way he was passing Bagnaia, really having a go at Bagnaia was impressive. And, you thought, wow, this guy's really getting stuck in. But unfortunately for Johann and for the rest of the field, he is up against the might of Ducati. And, it isn't even though we have just gone through another off season, Ducati are still in a similar position of strength as they were a year ago. Top 5 all Ducati riders, and a couple of those riders, as Zarco intimated, the likes of Marc, the likes of Franco Morbidelli, guys that were struggling to get top 10s a couple of years ago when they were on Japanese machinery, now leading the way. But I think it's a really good sign for Honda. I think it's probably the first time since 2018 that Honda has made a really strong step forward with their package, and not just a step forward for one rider like Marquez. Because we're seeing in Luca Marini and Joan Mir's results as well that they're performing much better than they were last year. I know Paulo Espargaro started 2022 well, but that was kind of a false dawn. And when we got back to Europe, the Hondas really weren't competitive. So I think, you're going back 6 years really. And it's great to see. And, for all of their resources and all of their might, there is no reason why Honda shouldn't be fighting at the front of this championship with Ducati. But it's just taken a bit of direction and a bit of impetus from the Japanese side, a bit of reorganization, and they finally managed to get their head around some of these things. And it's great to see that they're kind of coming back into it. And there's justifiable sense that they are in that fight now for the kind of the second manufacturer, along with Aprilia. Yeah, along with Aprilia, because KTM and Yamaha at the moment are in kind of in diffs. So, great weekend for Honda, and I think it says it all that Zarco was a bit disappointed with 6th. I mean, a year ago they would have bitten your hand off for a 6th place.
I think we have to also. I mean, it's just one Grand Prix, even though there were positive signs as well in Thailand. The Honda's been struggling for rear grip, and this was also a kind of a weird circuit for that. Particular issue. I want to see how the Hondas do in Kota, then also in Jerez, and potentially around Le Mans as well. But, just because of different kind of climates and the different track states that we'll find. But it was good to hear Joan Mir on Saturday saying that he has a motorcycle now he feels he can push with. When he tried to do that last season, I think how many times did he end up on the floor? It was almost over 30 crashes. He was sort of like leading that crash chart. But, the thing now is that Honda, arguably on a level peg or superseding Yamaha, and then they find themselves in the same predicament where they've made gains, but then still there's a sizable gap where Ducati have lifted the bar because that GP24 is just a masterpiece. But I think it's good that you have somebody the size of HRC firing something close to all cylinders again. We might even get to the point, sort of guys, where we're looking at the riders thinking do they need a better rider to really take the bike onto the next step. Sadly, by the time we really get to that critical moment, we'll be kind of looking to 2027 and what Honda maybe have prepared for the new era of MotoGP.
Yeah, it's interesting you mentioned that, Ed, because we talked about this on the Paddock Note show yesterday as well, because David was talking about the fact that Honda looked this weekend to be that second best manufacturer, which is the first time in God knows how long where we've been thinking anything like that, as Neil had said. But it's one of those big challenges where Joan Mir is a world champion, but he's also the guy that crashed to just comical levels last year.
And the year before.
Yeah. Luca Marini is a guy that whenever he was on the Ducati was the only Ducati rider that couldn't win a race. If you think back to Alex Marquez was able to win sprints. So they've got 2 riders there that are good riders, but are they good enough? They've got Johann Zarco and Zarco has shown himself to be the rider that he is for so many years in the class. And it's one of those ones where he's a good rider. He's not the guy to lead your factory. And Honda are kind of stuck in a bit of no man's land, potentially.
How dare you say that about Johann Zarco after that weekend, Steve? Absolutely
flawless
podcast,
weekend. Rider of the weekend.
Yeah.
Put him on the factory Ducati.
Exactly.
It was interesting, though, because Hugo asked us basically a question that was answered by both of you there whenever it was very impressive weekend by Zarco, but with 5 Ducatis inside the top 5s, I can't see how anyone takes the fight to Ducati, and I don't think either any of us can really see that either. But
but don't forget, Steve, that Zarco was actually on a Ducati, and what he managed sort of 1 Grand Prix win in that time. Yeah. So it's unrealistic then to expect him to get on a Honda with a performance inferiority and then go ahead and beat those motorcycles. I mean, I think Zarco is a good rider. He's had a good weekend, but I don't think he's going to be sort of the next savior of HRC. And in fact, going off sort of the last point that I mentioned, who do Honda sign next in their next sort of contract cycle? Who are they going to be able to lure as like a sort of superstar and really, be the next kind of, I don't know, Marquez, if you like, in a positive sense and not like hogging all the direction sense.
Well, I will point out happily that Johann Zarco has won one more race than David Emmett ever thought he was going to win in the MotoGP class.
One more race than David Emmett. I thought that's a pretty easy.
So a thumbs up to him for that. And also, at least Honda now is in a position where some top riders will actually be thinking that is a decent prospect. That's a decent package that I could move to, because in the last 2 years, none of the top riders, someone like Jorge Martin has been available and on the market and would never even have. Well, I'm sure he considered Honda briefly, but it wasn't a realistic option to be competitive. It looks as though they're moving themselves back into that arena of, hey, maybe we could go knock on Pedro Acosta's motorhome door and offer him this massive contract, and he would consider it. And just briefly, I do agree with you, Ad. I mean, I talked about that false dawn in 2022. Let's wait another couple of races before we start saying Honda are back. But the early signs this season are really, really positive.
I want hot takes. I want quick takes. I want it where we've got YouTube content on the Paddock Pass podcast.
Neil, he's been 1 week in the US and he's come back all sensationalist. Listen to him.
You're all assholes. Anyway, just to move on to some of our questions from our patrons as well, because we do get a lot of these in over the course of the weekend. We also get a lot in on the Discord chat server as well. So if you sign up as a Paddock Pass podcast patron member, you get access to that. And over the whole weekend, it's just a constant stream of really good insight from the top 1% of MotoGP fans, really. So definitely worth signing up on that. Not from us. I'm very rarely talking on it because I'm there thinking people will find out about how little I know. But there's so many that have a lot of good insight on it, and definitely worth checking that out on patreon.com/Paddock Pass podcast. These are a few questions that came in from our patrons, and Brian Deere has asked us a question about Aprilia and where they're settling up right now, given that Bezzecchi and Ayagura have been in plenty of conversations already this year. How likely is it that Jorge Martin comes back and can win a race, Neil?
I would say it's looking okay. You have to imagine, you take what Agura's done the first 2 races, and I know he's been disqualified kind of as we've been recording this. It's come through that he has been disqualified from the race, but a really brilliant ride.
Do we still get his fantasy points? That's all that matters to me.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, because he's in my team.
There's my team as well.
A software infringement. So we're blaming David Emmett again.
Yeah, he hacked the Trackhouse system as well as the MotoGP fantasy system.
I'll tell you what, if you see where David is right now in the fantasy league, he's hacked nothing this year. It's tremendously disappointing for him.
Yeah, but if Agura's been managing 5th and 8th in his first 2 races, you would have to imagine a totally fit Jorge Martin with a good preseason behind him would be, fighting for top 4s, maybe fighting for the podium. I'm not sure, but yeah, it does look as though Aprilia certainly have taken a step ahead. That front end, the riders just keep talking about how good it is.
But if you look at the riders that haven't got much time on the RSGP at all, it's not going that well, is it? I mean, Bezzecchi's kind of horrific crash in the first corner. Ralph Fernandez was in a similar situation to Martin in terms of missing testing time. I mean, Agura's mentality and very level-headed approach has been an absolute advantage for him, I think, so far this season. And I just hope that Martin comes back and has a real like a similar approach, doesn't get too excited and doesn't end up throwing himself down the road again. It could be tempting now because as you say, the Aprilia does tend to invite this sort of commitment, certainly this year's model in terms of committing to stuff. But you have to imagine in the second half of the season he's going to be doing something because he's that good of a rider. Brian, I think it's a good question, and we hope that your boy Oliver is getting better after his crash at the weekend. That wasn't too good to see. So a shout out to Oliver, and I hope he's back on the bike soon.
Yeah, definitely. We had a question in from Jono as well, and it's a Brad Binder question, and it's a positive Brad Binder question. And what does Brad do differently to the other KTM riders that helps him to conserve his tyre out?
I'm glad Jono asked this, because I think, we have to give Brad some credit. I mean, it was a really strange weekend. In fact, Pedro Acosta, after the Grand Prix today, was saying, they need to analyze again why the RC16 is veering between being a motorcycle that's capable for the job in one session to having zero traction in the next. It's just been a bit sort of wild to tame at the moment. And Brad was in a predicament where, of course, he was punted out of the sprint on the first lap. They also had a technical problem in warm-ups. I think he did one lap. So from qualifying yesterday, he barely rode the circuit. So I thought, to make that start, it was kind of vintage Binder, wasn't it? Coming from 11th on the grid, I think he was almost into the top 5. And then he, pushed until that first tire drop. But KTM are just struggling to maximize grip, when the rear grip, when the bike's leant over. I mean, they're getting there. And again, I think they'll be one of the brands and the manufacturers or the teams that really find a forward step after Jerez. I think they have to mark that in the calendar, in terms they have to get through these flyaways, then get back to Europe, and then I think they'll make forward progress. But at the moment, they're almost like still testing, which sounds strange. But then you do have Acosta coming into the factory team, and you do have 2 brand new riders there, and Bastianini and Viñales will be bringing their own kind of feedback, and it just takes a while to put everything together. But Binder, I don't think, is particularly doing anything especially different. Acosta also said, after the race today, that he and Binder have exactly the same problem, but Brad, of course, has, that many more seasons. I mean, he joined the team in 2020, so he has sort of a real flavor for the KTM kind of idiosyncrasies, and that probably made the differences today.
You said it takes a while, Ed, but I mean, KTM have now had over a full calendar year to try and get their heads around this. It's the rear tire, and it's still not come up.
Yeah, that's the mystery, isn't it? But then, even just seeing sort of the KTM technicians in Thailand, there were a couple of stern looks, stern faces. They were still trying to deduce or break the mystery themselves. But yeah, I mean, is it a suspension thing? I mean, KTM using WP, is it a carbon chassis thing? That's something I still think they're trying to sort of lock in and solve.
Yeah, I think for me as well, that contrast between Binder and Acosta also comes down to their riding styles. You look at Pedro, and he's still got that very unique style compared to everyone else on the grid. And when you're unique, it means that maybe you're doing something better than others. But it also means with Pedro's style, he's plowing that bike, and it's tough to make the tires last. Binder's able to make that tire last.
Yeah. Also, Steve, sorry to cut across you, but people watching the feed might have seen Acosta holding a cold Red Bull to his forearms. When he was in the pit box after the race, and he said it was not bike related, but he's having arm pump issues, and the only time he's ever had arm pump issues in his whole career was after his first MotoGP race. So there was something there, something about the way he's riding. Maybe he also has to transition his style a little bit, whereas it all came so easy to him in 2024. There's still some work to do on his side as well.
Yeah, I think that the big thing was it came easy at the start of that season. And then as the season went on, you're looking for that progress. And Pedro came in and he was so competitive right from the outset that it probably gave a little bit of a false dawn as well for what it's like in MotoGP, because we've got so many great riders in there now. You need to have all your ducks in a row. But when we look at some of the other questions that came in from our patrons, Cameron and Craig asked us very closely related questions. Cameron asked, on a scale of 1 to 10, how motivated is Pedro to leave KTM? And then Craig asked, if Pedro leaves, where's his best landing spot? So, Neil, on a scale of 1 to 10, what are you thinking for Pedro's motivation?
I would say after the sprint, maybe like a 7. And then after today, it seemed that he was maybe like a 4. Because he did say that the bike had made a decent step forward from Saturday to Sunday. And I think he probably could have been in line to maybe be fighting there with Binder at the end, maybe ahead of Binder had it not been for the arm pump issues. And, it was a fairly mistake-free, from what we could see on the TV, it was a fairly consistent ride from Acosta. It wasn't anything like too wild or too out of line. It looked as though he, had his consistent head on and was trying to get the bike home. But yeah, it's not really where he expected to be, is it? And it's not as if KTM are any closer this year. It does look as though they're a little bit behind. I think he said on Saturday that we've made a step back. And that is concerning because Aprilia, Honda have made steps forward. I'm inclined to believe Yamaha will they might not have shown it just yet, but there were signs at certain points during pre-season that they have done as well. And yeah, it must be really frustrating for Pedro. I guess the obvious landing spot would be a spot in VR46. I mean, that was one of the rumours doing the rounds in Termas this weekend. Might be a little bit more difficult after the result of today. Franco Morbidelli getting his first podium since 2021. But yeah, we do know that Pedro is not going to be the most patient of riders. He did say that I've got a contract for this year and next year with KTM. But could there be an option to maybe leave at the end of this year? I mean, that's one of the things that's being speculated about at the moment.
Yeah, I think he has a tendency to throw little playful comments to the media about, his state of mind or his contract or whatever. And he doesn't hide his frustration particularly well. Of course, he's extremely young, but that's also an endearing trait, I guess you could say. It's what we want from sort of our athletes. But another thing as well, just to bear in mind, I think it takes a brave rider to sort of make a big change to a brand, when we're sort of 18 months away from a wholesale shift in MotoGP, not just for sort of, the technical rules, but also the tyre manufacturer. I mean, Ducati could go, in theory, from being the best manufacturer to one that struggles the most in 2027. It's, and Acosta's been supported and backed by KTM all the way through his career. I don't think he's flippant enough to dismiss that lightly on the back of like a couple of tricky first GPs. The temptation is there, of course, but would you really want to chuck away that factory rider status to get into a satellite team on an old bike for 1 year and then whatever?
I think if he's on a VR46 bike, he's not going to be on an old bike. And that'll be what will make up his mind, you'd imagine. It'll be trying to be on that most competitive package that he can be. And, things do change pretty quickly in the MotoGP paddock. And we can see that in our Alpine Stars Fantasy League, because last year's star of the show was David. And this year, he's not even mid-pack. He's nowhere. We've got 2,500 players in our league this season, so check that out on the Fantasy League. Just join our league, the Alpine Stars Paddock Pass Podcast League. And in that, Adam, are you just trying to get the wooden spoon?
Oh, come on, Steve. It can't be that bad.
Do you want to know how bad it is?
No, I don't. But also, I made a strategic switch. I took Acosta out of my team and put Binder in. I mean, surely that was inspired today. There's a couple more points.
Who else did you have? Let's have a look, actually, Ad, and see who else you had.
Marquez is a silver rider. So that makes me think that you're taking the piss a bit, Ad.
No, it was...
You're not entirely serious.
I know. Well, I had to pick pre-Thailand. So,
you're allowed to change it after each race weekend,
Yes and no. You only get two changes. Why did you
still pick Marc for Thailand as well? So you've got Brad Binder, you've got a KTM rider as your gold rider. Like
I know.
You had Alex Marquez in there, at least. We'll give you that.
Iagura's been disqualified now.
His points are still there right now as I'm looking at your standings.
So
that's
it could be even worse. That's what you're saying.
Yamaha as a manufacturer.
Yamaha looked the balls in pre-season. I thought we were going to be flying.
Me. This is dreadful.
I would just like to point out that I'm 496th, yet my team consists of the Marquez brothers and Ducati is the team manufacturer, and I'm 496. So the competition is pretty fierce in the
Who's your other two?
Paddock Pass Podcast Fantasy League, Agura and Fermin.
Fermin. Jesus.
I've got Agura and Fermin was in there because he was the only one that I could afford, and I was there. He's still on the Ducati. It'll come good at some stage. But David has got Marc and Bezzecchi as his gold riders, so one of them worked out okay. He's got Agura and Zarco as his silver riders, so both of them were decent points offerings. But obviously the silver riders, it's only half points. So for David Emmett, it's just not going great. So David's down there 1,589. And the good news for Dave is he's 200 places ahead of Wooden Spoon over here, Wheeler.
Oh, jeez.
But
right.
we'll obviously see how the season goes. Maybe it's all going to come back to Yamaha and Brad Binder, and you're going to be fine without changing your team week to week, Ad. But I'm not holding that much hope.
We drew 2-2 with Leeds United, who were top of the championship of the weekend, so I'll take that instead.
Were you 2-0 up in that game as well?
Yeah. Oh, come on! Look, we're just looking at positives, all right?
Okay. We'll look at the positives. It wasn't good for any of us this week. Ipswich got hammered by Forest. Liverpool lost the cup. And we'll move swiftly onwards to our hire and fire as well. So, Adam, who are you firing for this week? Other than me as the host, obviously.
Yeah, your negativity, Steve, is just dragging me down. I'm just going to take an alternative view, and I'm going to fire anyone who goes to the Argentine Grand Prix in the future wearing an Argentina football shirt. It's been done. It's boring. We know Maradona as an icon and a hero. Stop wearing that fucking shirt. It just winds me up seeing it. And also, I love the passion that the fans have, but stop asking for riders as gloves. That's also just, again, find something new. I don't know, ask for a hand in marriage or something. But
I did see one sign at one race that said that they wanted the child of a rider. It was in Thailand.
Could I just remind Ad that 1986 was 38 years ago? Get over it, man. Come
hand
on.
of God. Yeah, indeed. No, just no. I mean, leave the football out of it. You don't need to do it.
In fairness, Neil, we'll never let Adam forget about all the years of pain that he's had to go through.
Why am I doing this podcast with two Irishmen? My goodness, where's David when you need him?
Neil, what about you? Well, in fairness, David probably would side with us in this instance. But Neil, what about you? Who are you firing?
Yamaha, because it was
from Adam's fantasy team or in general?
Both. Well, no, Adam can keep it in his fantasy team for as long as he likes. But yeah, it was a pretty rotten weekend on the whole. There were some signs of positivity in Thailand. Jack Miller was pretty impressive overall. But here there wasn't really much to take away. I think, Fabio Quartararo could have been a couple of positions ahead had he not been tagged by Bezzecchi at the start. But yeah, he just said that they were trying too many things this weekend and it wasn't easy, almost as if they got a little bit lost. Rin said when Marini passed him, he immediately put 5 seconds, well, not immediately, but he eventually put 5 seconds into him. That's where we are at the moment, whereas his exact statement. So yeah, Honda clearly have taken a bit of a step ahead of their Japanese counterparts. And yeah, we're still waiting to see signs of that Sepang potential that we all thought Yamaha were going to show this year. And yeah, 2 rounds in and it hasn't been pretty.
What about your hire for the weekend, Neil? Who are you hiring?
Well, it was going to be Agura, Steve, because I thought he had a fantastic race after a bad sprint when he started poorly and yeah, made a lot of mistakes by his own admission, but really solid race on Sunday. However, he was obviously disqualified. So I'm going to go with someone we haven't really spoken about so far, Franco Morbidelli, getting his first podium in MotoGP since Jerez 2021. And yeah, just really attacked the occasion. I mean, he has been the source of some ridicule this year, and for some, quite justifiably so. He has been not the sharpest with some of his antics across the practice sessions and the races so far this season. But I mean, that was a really quality ride, and on the soft rear tire as well. When the other Ducatis were on the medium, except Digia, yeah, he was able to, close in the Marquez brothers a little bit at first, and then comfortably keep Bagnaia behind towards the end. So yeah, one of Franco's best MotoGP weekends, you would say. And yeah, finally, a reminder of the rider that we remember from all that time back in 2020.
And Adam, what about you? Who are you hiring from the weekend?
I had Zarco down on the list, Steve. Just for pedigree, he's riding, I'd say, arguably in the form of his career. But in terms of pedigree, I'd still give the best bits to, say, Joan Mir and Luca Marini. But, I don't think you can argue with the job that he's doing at the moment. So, but like Neil said, we have to give credit to Franco Morbidelli, and not in the least because he's also going to be appearing on the podcast in the next couple of weeks. So well done, Franco. Good job.
He wasn't our rider of the weekend, though. That was Johann Zarco and your hire as well. I think for me, I actually would have hired Honda in general because they had 3 bikes inside the top 10 in the Grand Prix. We were able to see Mir have a second sprint points finish in a row. Zarco obviously on the front row. I thought it was a really good weekend for Honda all in.
3 in the top 10.
3 in the top 10, yeah. And it's impressive to see the turnaround. And that could be what we see for a lot of this season, where whenever you've got that hot iron, you have to try and make it count. Even if it's not for wins and podiums, it's just about being able to find something that you're able to look at and say that there's signs of progress there. So I thought for me, that was Honda this week.
Hot iron, Steve. Are you getting your golf reference in just at the end of the podcast?
Always, my
Not
irons
bad.
are
It only took you
always, they're always
55
hot.
minutes.
They're always hot. The putter's cold though, Ad, but we can't get everything. But one thing I will say is actually the next Grand Prix is in Coda, so there's plenty of good golf courses in and around Coda. I was tempted to fly out to that one, but I'm going to give that a miss. But we're going to have the opportunity as well, Neil, to meet up with a few of our patrons over the course that weekend inside the paddock. That's going to be a lot of fun. And Austin's always one of those rounds that everyone looks forward to. It's a really cool event and one definitely worth going. And it's one that I always miss out on not being in the Grand Prix paddock any longer. So I'm always jealous whenever I see everyone getting out to Texas for that one. And we'll obviously be bringing everyone fully up to date with all the dealings in the MotoGP paddock before that with next week's show, where we'll also be previewing into the week for Coda. We'll also have some World Superbike shows coming up. Myself, Gordo, and Evo are getting ready for Portimao. So we've got the second round of the championship coming up. There was the Portimao test just gone now as well. And interestingly, I will say that Top Rack is at 3-1 for the World Championship. Absolutely dominated that test, so it might be worth a little side bet for any of our listeners that have waited this long until the end of the show. As ever for us, though, it's a big thank you to Renthal Street and to Pole Position Travel for supporting the podcast. So check out renthal.com and polepositiontravel.com to see all that's available for you as well. And we'll be back next week, where hopefully we've got David Emmett back from the shellacking that he took this week in the fantasy that took its toll on his back.